Well, good afternoon, everyone. I understand we still have a few more people joining the webinar, but we've got a critical mass now to kick off and begin. My name is Gordon Flake. I'm the CEO of the Perth US Asia Center, and I'm delighted to welcome you all today to the virtual but public launch of the center's newest publication, Maximizing Australia's Memberships, Recalibrating Australia's Engagement with the Indo-Pacific. On behalf of the Perth US Asia Center, we thank you all for making the time to join us here this evening. Let me begin by acknowledging, albeit virtually, those of us that are here in Perth are on the lands that are traditionally custodianed by the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and we pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging, as well as to the traditional custodians of lands of our panelists around the country and those of you watching this as well. It's a great honor for the center to release a report by our senior policy fellow in Canberra, Hayley Channer. I think many of you watching are from DFAT or elsewhere in Canberra who have a more than a passing interest in the topic of research that Hayley has covered. But we're delighted to have you join us as well. Many of you may know that Hayley has been recently awarded a Fulbright fellowship, so she'll be heading off actually next week for 3 weeks in Washington, D.C. She has an increasingly popular podcast called 15 Minutes in Canberra, which has become must listen for those in the political / policy sphere. And that will be transitioning to, I think, I'm not sure what the exchange rate is, Hayley, whether 15 minutes in Canberra equates to 15 minutes in Washington, D.C., or maybe your pro rate is going forward. But as it is, we're really fortunate to examine an issue of great importance to Australia more broadly. I recall probably about 15 years ago reading a business book called Good to Great, written by Jim Collins. It's actually probably one of the more seminal business management strategy books in the last several decades. And he just profiled about 8 different companies who kind of went from just being good companies to truly great companies. And he came up with some remarkable shared characteristics among those books. But among those, among the characteristics was the creation of a stop doing list, a prioritization exercise. And I think it's quite evidence from those of you who had a chance to see the report in recent years, there really has been an explosion of strategic groupings in which Australia is involved. Just think about the last year alone, the focus on AUKUS and the increased focus on the Quad. And on the one hand, it is tremendous that Australia is more in demand than ever before, has a greater reach and a greater profile, not just in the Indo-Pacific, but globally than ever before. But with that comes some real questions about prioritization. And Hayley has done a magnificent job at kind of looking at Australia's membership in these relations and putting a analytical eye over those in the process. We're very fortunate today to initially be hearing from Hayley. She'll give a quick overview of her report. And then we've been very generously joined today by 2 wonderful panelists who will be able to kind of share their insights with us on the report, their reactions, maybe some critiques or criticisms, hearty agreements. I'm not sure exactly where you'll come down, but we're joined by Susan Harris-Rimmer. Susan, thank you for joining us. She's the director of the Policy Innovation Hub at Griffith University. We really wanted to make sure that this was a bi-coastal program. So we've got from Brisbane to Perth. And then, of course, someone who needs no introduction to probably most people on this call, Richard Maud, currently a senior fellow at the Asia Society Policy Institute, but with a storied career in public policy in Australia. And my guess is, for most of us, some of these acronyms will be unfamiliar. For Richard, they're probably all tattooed on the back of his brain somewhere, and some of them might spark flashbacks, both positive and negative, during the course of the process. But once again, thank you everybody for joining us today. Hayley, I'm going to turn it over to you initially, just to kind of lay out the process and some of the core conclusions of your report, which is now online on our website and available. So Hayley, over to you.
Thanks very much, Gordon, and a huge thank you to Richard and Susan for helping me launch this report and also their advice in the process. And for everybody watching, actually, I saw some really great names of my friends, former colleagues, and other people who I consulted on this paper. So thank you for joining us. What I'm going to start by saying is that, later this month, we're going to have another Quad Leaders Summit. This time it's going to be in Tokyo. And depending on the result of the federal election, either Prime Minister Morrison or Anthony Albanese will attend. Whoever is elected Saturday week, Australia's Prime Minister has his work cut out for him in terms of attending major conferences and forums each and every year of his term. Just to give you some figures on this, the Prime Minister next year in 2023 will need to attend or be expected to attend around 10 major forums. The Quad, East Asia Summit, APEC, IORA, Australia-ASEAN Summit, Australia-US-Japan Trilateral, Pacific Island Forum, and the Asia-Europe meeting. And that's just the Indo-Pacific. It doesn't include larger international gatherings like the UN or G20. But if the PM has it bad, the Foreign Minister has it a lot worse. The Foreign Minister, whether that will be Marise Payne or Penny Wong, both of them are debating tomorrow at the National Press Club, by the way, they're going to have to attend upwards of 20 major forums in the Indo-Pacific, having to accompany the Prime Minister at his forums, as well as run their own Foreign Minister-led dialogues. I mean, there is also a Quad Foreign Ministers meeting. Now, this doesn't even touch on the work that many people watching are doing behind the scenes, the workload that trickles down from these meetings at the senior official and the working level. I personally have worked both at the Department of Defence on a number of strategic dialogues that are annual, and I've also worked in the Defence Minister's office. And the amount of work generated by these events is just eye-watering. It compounds as you go down the levels from Prime Minister down. So, investing all this time and effort from the Prime Minister level, etc., what's Australia getting from these engagements? What's our payoff that we're receiving? Well, obviously, you can't put a value on diplomacy. Diplomacy is a bit like goodwill. You don't really know how much goodwill you've got until you try and ask someone for a favour. You could think about Australia and all of its relationships in the Indo-Pacific as kind of your own personal friendships, and think about when you want to move house and you pick up the phone and try and call one of your friends who's actually there to help you pick up and move your house. So, diplomacy is extremely important, and it's completely undeniable that Australia does derive huge benefit from its engagements in these multi and minilateral groups, whether that's shaping the views of other countries in our region, gaining more defence cooperation with them, or clinching an important trade deal. Australia basically gets to shape the region that we live in, improve our defence and security capabilities, and drive our economy through these regional groupings. The problem isn't that the groupings aren't valuable. The problem is that we have too many. There are just too many Australian group memberships, and we can't continue to sustain our engagement at the current level into the future. Now, look, why am I saying this now? Why now? Why not some other time? Well, look, with the addition of things like that Quad Leaders Summit, which we're now seeing 2 per year, as well as AUKUS, and last year we saw a new Australia-ASEAN dialogue, plus there's a whole range of new trilaterals. There are 6 trilaterals that Australia is a part of. Altogether, Australia is a member of more than 20 strategic groupings in the Indo-Pacific. They started with the Five Eyes back at the end of World War II, back in 1956, and they kind of bookended with AUKUS in September last year. And of the 20 groups Australia is a member, we joined half of those in the last decade alone. So the rate at which we're joining these groups is really kind of rapidly expanding. So with all of these new additions, what's stopping us from keeping our diplomatic engagement at the same level as we've always done? Well, look, in my view, there's 3 main things that mean we can't keep doing business as usual into perpetuity. The 3 things are the COVID pandemic, our worst strategic circumstances, and our proliferating groups when our resources are finite. So on the COVID question, for example, I mean, that's self-explanatory. COVID has changed the entire world. It's changed our region. But really important to note is it's put huge pressure on our politicians, on our government agencies, and frankly, on people just generally. And that's creating a lot more work where there wasn't work before. And we're now into the 3rd year of the pandemic, and, there's kind of no end in sight. But the point is that COVID makes us look at the region and the world differently. The second is about that worsening strategic circumstances. We can't ignore the fact that rising strategic tensions in our region, a war in Ukraine, potential conflict over Taiwan, North Korea and its nuclear missiles, there's just no getting away from the fact that we live in a more dangerous environment. And what that means is that's putting a premium on each and every one of Australia's diplomatic engagements being as impactful as possible. We need to be more strategic than we ever have before. And the last point I wanted to make is these groups keep proliferating and Australia's resources are finite. Whether that's time in the annual cycle, the availability of senior politicians, or just departmental capacity, Australia's resources are finite. Even if you gave a blank check to DFAT or at least funded them a bit more than what they're getting, you're not going to be able to produce the best results. We need to have a clear-eyed assessment of where we're headed. So what's the solution? Well, for me, the solution was three-pronged. First, Australia needs to assess the current value and potential of our Indo-Pacific groups and then identify where we're duplicating effort. Second, we need to conduct what I call a mapping exercise of our national resources required to sustain Australia's participation on an annual basis. And we need to have some buffer in that because there are obviously more groups coming down the pipeline. So we need extra space. We can't just keep it to the letter. And thirdly, what I think we need to do is create a regional dialogue hierarchy and identify what groups we want to increase our resources to, what ones we want to maintain the level, and what ones we want to limit the resources, and actually which groups we just want to get rid of completely. So in my paper, Maximising Australia's Memberships, I've made an attempt at points 1 and 3 of what I just mentioned, assessing the value of Australia's current Indo-Pacific groups and creating a regional dialogue hierarchy and suggesting their resourcing. I wasn't able to conduct a mapping exercise because the resources needed to do that requires you to contact government departments, and really a huge body of work is required just to understand what are junior staff spending their time on. And even more than how officials spend their time, you'd have to convince the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister which groups they should stop attending or which ones they need to put more of their effort in. So that's a much bigger national effort that only officials and leaders can do. But what I did with points 1 and 3 is I came up with some key findings, and I'll share them with you now. So the first one is that judging the current value as well as the potential of Australia's group memberships is really subjective. It's not an exact science, and as regional groups grow and evolve over time, at one point they might have been hugely beneficial and effective, and at other times they could be totally useless. So something that was valuable in the past might not be valuable now. So the point about that is not only is it challenging to look at the different characteristics of these groups, but it's also subject to change. I've been watching quite a lot of Downton Abbey recently. I don't know if anyone else watching has seen Downton Abbey, but to use a bit of a Downton Abbey analogy, judging which Indo-Pacific groups are best to advance Australia's national interests can be a bit like picking between romantic suitors. Some of them are well established in society and they're really wealthy, but they're old and unattractive and unwieldy. Some of them are young and full of promise. Who knows how successful this suitor could be in 10 or 20 years. And some of them, you wonder why you were ever attracted to them in the first place and wish they would just leave the party at Downton Abbey. The point I'm trying to make is that each group has its own attributes and drawbacks, and you have to judge them across different criteria and continue to assess your options as they change. So with the addition of new groups, for example. So how do I judge the value of Australia's Indo-Pacific group memberships? Well, there's a number of factors you have to consider. The first one is the group membership itself. Who's actually in this group? Is it the right players or not? Another thing is its issue focus. What is it actually focused on, and do we value those things? Another thing I looked at is how senior is the level of engagement, and therefore how much potential is there to get, results quickly or have, from the leader level engaged, or is it just a meeting that's at a senior official level? I also considered the strategic circumstances that these groups exist in, the trajectory of bilateral relations between member countries. Were those bilateral relations on the uptick or the downtick? I also considered how much momentum and energy there has been at previous in-person meetings. Now, Richard has attended, these meetings in person. I think Richard might describe it as the vibe. What's the vibe in the room at the time? And the other thing I thought about was, what's the potential for these groups to incorporate new members and expand? So brass tacks, there are 4 key groupings I suggest Australia invest more resources. That's not to say that they're the most important groups Australia belongs to, far from it. They are the groups that I think that with added resourcing and investment, they have the potential to deliver more for Australia's national interests. These groups are, in no particular order, the Quad, the East Asia Summit, the Pacific Islands Forum, and a very new trilateral few people will have heard of, the Australia-India-Indonesia trilateral. There are 3 groups I think that Australia should significantly downgrade or withdraw from. They are MICTA, which is the Mexico, Indonesia, Korea, Turkey, Australia grouping, ASEM, which is the Asia-Europe meeting, and FELAC, which is the Forum for East Asia and Latin America Cooperation. And I've also put all of these groups into a hierarchy, which I include in the report. So I want to take you through this hierarchy now. Now, there's a lot going on in this slide, and I'm going to walk us through it. On the left-hand side, you can see the list of groupings that are included in this hierarchy diagram. And I hope, if I haven't been able to illustrate it, I really hope this diagram does. Australia is a member of too many groups in the Indo-Pacific for an annual basis. And what I've done here is really say, these are the 4 groupings I think we can increase our resources to. These are the ones down here where I think we should downgrade and withdraw. And the vast majority of groups, I actually think we are resourcing appropriately. So, for example, there are some really important groups in this category. There's AUKUS, for example. And no, AUKUS doesn't have a leaders level or a foreign minister meeting, but I can tell you the number of senior officials and working level groups that are involved in AUKUS is astonishing. The amount of national resources going to that enterprise is just huge. So no, AUKUS doesn't need more resources than what it's currently got. But I think that these other 4 groupings are kind of the sweet spot of, if we invested more in them, we could actually get more out of them. So, for example, what I'm talking about resourcing, it's not just money. It's not just dollar figures. I'm actually thinking things like pre-caucusing key members of these groupings in the lead up to the engagement, bringing new ideas, new innovations, new energy to the meeting itself, and doing more follow-up and follow through after the meeting happens, which is just our absolute weakest point in Australia, because we're already desperately trying to prepare the Prime Minister or the Minister for their next engagement, which we're already late for. I think if we did more of that with those 4 groupings, we actually could leverage those memberships a bit more. And also, we could talk about this sort of structure ad nauseum. The point I'm trying to make with this isn't that this is the correct final answer to all of Australia's problems. What my report does is it suggests Australia needs to do an exercise that's like this. It might be that we come up with totally different groups to prioritise and downgrade, but we can't keep going on as we have been doing. And actually, I might mention too, there are groups in here I actually didn't include. So, for example, you might think I'm missing a few, there's a group called the Pacific Quad, PQuads. And I don't include that one because that group is specifically about HADR and responding to natural disasters. The groups I included in my list are ones that I think have a diplomatic, security, or strategic element to them. And that, HADR one, or groups that are created just for environmental protection, for instance, around the Mekong Delta, I felt like, no, they're not exactly the right for this discussion. But hopefully this kind of illustrates how many groups we're dealing with, and it starts a conversation about where we should actually be reallocating resources from. Okay, So with that, what I'll just say is I'm really excited to hear perspectives from Richard and Susan. And I hope that we can actually get Australian leaders and officials realising that as you add more of these groups to the equation and you don't take any away, what you're really doing is stretching our capacity, stretching our influence and impact. And it's always difficult to downgrade. I'm sure Richard might talk about this a little bit in his comments, but something's got to give. And I think that this kind of framework and a way of looking at it is a starting point.
Haley, thank you so much. That was so clearly expressed and very thought-provoking in the process. If anybody doubts that the Perth USA Center has academic freedom internally and that we're not introspective, back in 2014 and 2015, we actually, myself personally, produced 2 back-to-back MICTA reports. And now I've got to try to figure out what I'm going to do with those MICTA tattoos I got, which is it's a little bit problematic, but really appreciate that. Richard, I'm going to turn to you first. Given your long and distinguished tenure in government, I'm not sure whether you're a perpetuator or a victim, but clearly you'll have some opinions on this report. And I'd welcome your kind of insights to the conclusions that Haley has drawn.
Yeah, thanks, Gordon. Well, the short answer to that is that I'm both a perpetrator and a victim. But well, first of all, pleasure to be here with you and Haley and Susan, and congratulations, Haley, on a really terrific report. It's a great read, and you know, it really does, in a nice, punchy, graphically attractive way, lay out the diversity and sheer number of Indo-Pacific forums that Australia is now involved in, and the challenges of servicing these. You know, I should say that Australia's always been a pretty enthusiastic participant, if not a founding member, of all sorts of Indo-Pacific organisation, and it's been part of our diplomatic DNA. It's always been about connecting Australia to the broader region, both in an economic and security sense. But it is nonetheless striking, as Haley says in her report and in her short remarks today, how this sort of system of groups keeps growing, and in some ways the pace has quickened. So I thought I might just offer a couple of quick reflections about why that might have happened. Why do we keep seeing these groups pop up, and why are they coming faster, and why are they getting smaller in many instances? And I think there's probably 3 main drivers here, and most of them come back to just the nature of the world at the moment, in particular the region we're in. We all know that we're in a much more contested, divided, in some ways fragmenting a world, and we certainly see that in our region. And those divides are now running through particularly the larger regional organisations. So it's hard to get a consensus on things. It's hard to get consensus sometimes just on words on a piece of paper, let alone on actually getting things done. And we can certainly see that in ASEAN itself, which is increasingly struggling to find common positions that give it any agency over really big challenges, whether it's Myanmar or the South China Sea, or what to do about the increasing press of competition from China and the United States. And then, of course, for Australia, we can see it in the ASEAN-centred architecture. You can see it in the East Asia Summit. You can see it in the ASEAN Regional Forum, in the ASEAN Defence Ministers meeting plus. So these meetings are becoming, they're not unimportant. I'll get to that in a minute, but they're becoming harder to use in ways that actually are useful for Australia and achieve outcomes. I remember complaining at an ASEAN Regional Forum meeting, notably to the Russian delegate, telling him that the Apollo program had put a man on the moon in less time than it had taken the ASEAN Regional Forum to not take a decision on a really hopelessly benign, low-level confidence-building measure that was about cyber points of contact in everyone's respective national systems. So look, that's one issue. That's one issue. But it's not just about size. It's not just about, well, can you get more done in smaller groups? As we all know, of course, it's a lot more these days about doing things in like-minded groups, because that also maximizes your chance of getting things done. And there are many examples of these like-minded groups in Haley's report. But of course, the one that really jumps out that's really taken off is the Quad in its second iteration. We could talk a bit more about that. And then I think the third trend that's at work here is that Australia wants to strengthen its direct relations with Asia, by which I mean it increasingly wants to do things in Asia without in constellations that don't include the United States, and that's where some of these other trilaterals and other groups have arrived. I said earlier that the problems in those bigger organisations doesn't mean we can and should abandon them. There are some, particularly the ASEAN-centred ones, that we just have to stick with. We have to do our best to be a constructive partner and make them work as well as we can for many, many reasons. It's about being a reliable and trusted regional player. It's about showing our support for ASEAN. At the working level, sometimes you can make gains in these organisations. I really used to endure ASEAN Regional Forum senior officials meetings, but at the working level, excuse me, you could get some good things done, like on maritime security. And then last point on why we have to stick at it, there's an issue here about inclusivity versus exclusivity. So if we don't show up, then other less inclusive groups might go forward. Now, Gordon, I've got one more point to make about how we get out of these organisations, but I'm going to throw to Susan and just get a glass of water if you don't mind.
Fantastic. And over to you.
Sure thing. So it's my very great pleasure to be here, and I'm also really excited just to see Haley's voice so prominent in this space. It's I've been around long enough to appreciate more and more female voices in the security space. I'm absolutely thrilled to see it and delighted by it, and we will be Fulbrights together, thanks to all our years merging into one in DC. So we'll certainly take on DC. So I just wanted to basically, I had the same impression as Richard, in the sense of, are we treating the symptom rather than the cure, in the sense that if you add development, which I always do, to my lens of the region, then you get even more of a noodle soup of the region. And it made me think that perhaps one of the things that we could think about is that all of these initiatives require sunset clauses. I know that's a legal idea. I'm an international lawyer, but the idea that perhaps we shouldn't enter things without having built-in sunset clauses where there's a decent evaluation, because there is always, and making that clear from the start, because it is so awkward to extract oneself from institutions. There's a lovely sociologist called Zygmunt Bauman that talks about zombie institutions in globalization, and it's just so true of many diplomatic initiatives. But it also made me think exactly that the reason we have so many workarounds like these is because the regional project in our region is blocked or dwindling. And if you think about what's happening in the Ukraine, and I'm looking at the regional responses, I'm not confident that we could have the same kind of regional strength in dealing with those kinds of issues as you're seeing, in Africa and in every other region. There is just much stronger regional architecture than we have. So I suppose I don't want DFAT to take its eye off the prize, which is strengthening the regional integration, the regional project. And so that's why I guess I'd like to talk about the blue elephant in the room, in my view, which is where the heck is the UN in Asia? And where is Australia's investment in the Asian brand of the UN, which has just gone missing? We used to invest in Australian representatives in the UN system in Asia, in the Asian headquarters, particularly in Bangkok. We don't seem to do that anymore. But also, you know, it just doesn't seem to have the, maybe it should, but it doesn't have the ability to play an active role in the Asian region the way it should. So, you know, a lot of the problems we're having with all these unilateral things, because the UN is not doing its job in our region. So that's another thing to think about as well. It really breaks my heart to think of the, you know, if DFAT can't manage conflict prevention and integration in the Asia Pacific region at this point of our history, then what is DFAT for? That is what DFAT is for, and it should be funded for that priority. That is exactly what diplomacy is for. So I guess my response to Hayley's excellent report was to think I'm not prepared to yield that ground that DFAT should just do more with less. I'm not prepared to yield that ground. Having said that, you're absolutely right. It's just a reality. But it makes me very angry. You know, we shouldn't have to be making terrible decisions like that. So I'm quite nervous about the cliques that I guess Richard Maud talked about, the idea that we're, you know, increasingly with our like-mindeds in kind of, you know, showing our colours in various places. I'm not sure that is actually promoting gender conflict prevention, which is my major criteria for what makes something useful. All right, so I have two other small, and I just around DFAT. I'm not always, you know, we do have to accept that leaders have preferences. So Julie Bishop liked MICTA and liked EORA, and she liked them for very reasonable reasons. She liked the fact that EORA prioritised Western Australia's place in the world. She also liked MICTA because it gave her a different relationship with the Indonesian Foreign Minister. So I think leader preferences are important, and you know, there's not much DFAT can do about that. So I have two critiques. So I don't think that MICTA belongs in the list just because I don't see it as separate to the G20. You know, I see it as very linked to Australia's participation to the G20, and I don't see it as a separate piece of regional architecture. So, but having said that, you know, in the sense that it has proliferated in the way that it has, I completely agree with Hayley's critique. But I do think we need to think about MICTA in the context of the G20, and in that context, we have to think much more strategically about the regional participants in that meeting. I'm very, you know, this is the big Asian summit season coming up. You know, we've got the G20 in Indonesia, we've got ASEAN in Thailand, we've got, APEC and ASEAN in Cambodia. It's a huge November for the region, and it's been completely overwhelmed by Russia's participation in those meetings. So it's meant to be our region's time to shine, and it's not happening because it's always dominated by what's going on in the rest of the world. We have to enforce the importance of our region. And that's why I agree with the Indonesia, India, Australia trilateral, because that does work with the G20 participation. And I just want to add another slight critique, which is you focused on suitors in your fabulous Downton Abbey analogy, but what about us as the debutante, right? You know, how attractive is Australia as a debutante to the region? And I think that is something we have to work on much harder because, you know, it's not just about who we choose, it's about why people choose us as a partner. And I'm not entirely sure that we have that piece worked out. And then I guess I just think that there might be possibilities to widen and downgrade so that it's not DFAT's problem to run all these, but that requires DFAT to yielding a little bit of control, which it doesn't like doing. So I think it's quite interesting to think about how we might think about APEC and EORA particularly as a more soft power kind of organisations where perhaps other kinds of Australian bodies can step up to the plate. Right, so that's my comments. I hope that's useful.
Oh, extremely useful. Thank you so much, Susan. Richard, I'm going to go back to you. You had one final point you wanted to make there before I opened it up.
Yeah, thanks, Gordon. My throat is telling me to talk less, so I'll keep my answers shorter from now on. So Hayley's already talked about the problem of how do you get out of the ones that actually aren't doing really what you want them to do anymore? And she's careful to have an option of downgrading rather than just withdrawing. And, it can be much harder than it sounds. Susan mentioned that Julie Bishop was attracted to MICTA, which is certainly true. That is, at least until Erdogan really killed it. But so too was the just departed Korean President Moon, who, for reasons that used to bewilder me, was obsessed with MICTA and really saw it as a forum that hadn't lost its force and impetus. It was, part of an era in which middle powers would get together and do things. And, I'd get this constant stream of, well, that's an exaggeration. I would get senior Korean diplomats coming to me and say, we really must do a leaders meeting for MICTA, to which we would say, well, why? What's the point? So, there's always somebody that wants one of these things. I wonder if that's the case in Australia still with ASEM. If there was one that you could really test about doing something incredibly brave and actually saying, you know what, we don't actually need to be there. It might be ASEM, which in my view is sort of irredeemable. I say that with some chagrin because I led the team that was, how shall I put this? Instructed, perhaps ordered is the best word, to get membership of ASEM. But really, Australia gets absolutely nothing out of ASEM. And if there was ever one that you could just do something unorthodox and say, well, actually, we're going to go, then that would be it.
Thank you, Richard. I've got a lot of questions and directions I want to take this conversation, but I'm aware that we've got some remarkable people joining us on the chat. And I want to bring into the conversation their questions before I launch into it. And that last transition, I think, is very helpful in that process. Jeffrey Robertson was asking a broader question about whether or not we could maintain some of these organizations through digitalization. So right now we're doing this virtually from different homes and rooms and bedrooms. And over the last 2 years, we've learned to do an awful lot via Zoom. I'm just kind of curious as to whether or not some of the time burden, on any of them, and any of the side of the spectrum, might be better addressed rather than in person through digitalization, through virtual contacts, et cetera. So I'll throw that out there first. Haley, we'll start with you. Then others who have experienced it directly will know the strengths and the weaknesses of this format.
Yeah, thanks so much to Jeffrey Robertson. And I've learned so much from his work. And I'm really glad that he's on this call because he's written about MICTA as well. And the point I would make is that, there was some silver linings to COVID in that, yes, all of our meetings went online. And it was, cheaper for us because we didn't have to do the travel. There was less to organize, et cetera, et cetera. The problem that I see with I think that's turning some of these meetings digital is a transition to getting rid of them, a gateway drug to getting rid of these groups, because we can downgrade them by saying, look, why don't we do it virtually? Why I would caution against doing things virtually is for reasons that everyone knows extremely well who's joining us today, which is that you don't do diplomacy virtually. You don't get a lot done virtually. And even me just trying to express myself and express my ideas in this virtual format is completely different to feeling the vibe in the room and to, grabbing Susan aside or grabbing Richard aside and nutting things out in the hallway over, the food that you scoff on the side of a very senior meeting, or the people that you bump into in the hallways. There's nothing that can replace that. And for that reason, the meetings that we don't care about should go virtual.
Very good. Richard, you made reference to the fact that some of the senior leaders meetings may be worthless, but there's an awful lot that gets done on the sides of that. Obviously, that would be one inhibitor to this suggestion. It's hard to do side meetings when you're just having a direct virtual conversation like this. Any other thoughts you might have?
Well, I actually don't think I could improve on Haley's answer. I think, and this is perhaps where Jeffrey was going anyway, I think for something like MICTA, if you can't make it disappear entirely, then make life easy for yourself and do as much of it you can digitally. But for the other ones, no, we do have to be there. And I think one thing I hear from my former colleagues in the department, but also from other diplomats that I talk to, is that the ability to do things digitally and to realise that it can actually work is here to stay, and we'll do more of that. But as Hayley said, it just doesn't and can't replace being there. And people who are diplomats want to get back to talking to other diplomats in person.
Yeah, thanks. Susan, anything further to add?
Well, it's just one thing when Hayley was talking about the amount of work it takes to prepare for a leader to attend a regional summit. It did make me think there is also an extremely complicated bilateral usually as well. So, we would have, for example, in Cambodia, a bilateral of different scope because they're hosting, right, a regional forum at the same time. So I think we've got to just get really smart about, trying to hit quite a few targets at once with some of these issues. I guess that's why I was thinking of MICTA as really a side group of the G20. So there's no reason why it has to have this enormous program of its own. It could just focus on, doing what it does best. I guess I'm partial to MICTA because it's got South Korea and Indonesia, and that's why it's important to me. And we don't really, none of your other groupings really have South Korea in that formation the way it needs to be, I think. So I guess that's its appeal to me. But that idea of work and the work for post, I've seen posts really pretty overwhelmed by these things. So being much more strategic about the pressure we're putting on our diplomats is really important.
If I could chime in a little bit on this too, my presumption is, and again, those of you who have done it directly can chime in on this if I'm wrong, is that the actual meeting itself, the summit, the 1 or 2 days that you might be in the same room, is the proverbial tip of the iceberg. So whether you're doing it virtually for an hour or in your room for a day, that's the relatively small period of time. It's just the months and the months that lead up to it and coming to joint positions and coordinating the position internally. So I'm not so sure how much time you would actually save in the long run in terms of resources by just doing things digitally, presuming you're still going to have to go through the interagency coordination process and all the negotiations leading up to it. And that's, I think, what Susan was referring to in terms of the time at post on that regard. Also, the Perth U.S. Asia Center 2 years ago, when the pandemic first hit, was very quick to make this transition to digital. But in the last several months, and this is the first time we've done kind of this type of a digital launch in a long time, just because there's the law of diminishing returns, right? It worked really well for people that you know already. It's great for internal conversations within an organization or with organizations you're friends with, but it's not the right format to forge new relations, to meet new people. And so one thing that's been really apparent to us as an organization that in the last 2 years, there's an entirely rising generations, not even bringing into consideration political changes within democratic societies, et cetera. And it's going to be really hard to maintain those types of things virtually. So I had to say, I'm heading a week from tomorrow to Korea for the first time in 2.5 years. I've been away now for the longest period of time since 1986, and really kind of chomping at the bit just because of those connectivities that you're talking about, Susan. And then similarly, excited about the Shangri-La dialogue, not because of the keynote speeches, but just because of what takes place in the lobby and on the sidelines. So I appreciate that very much. Let me bring in another point of conversation. We're joined in the audience today by Tanaka Nobuo. Many of you will know him. He was headed an organization himself for years. He was president of the International Energy Agency in Paris, and then for years headed up the Sasakawa Peace Foundation in Tokyo, as well as a long time at the Institute for Energy Economics in Japan. So a real observer of our region. And he asked the question about where does ANZUS fit into this? And so obviously, I think probably even preceding kind of the Five Eyes might have been this question of an alliance network in the United States. So Hayley, I might start with you, and then I've got a specific spin on the U.S. role in these things first. But how would you fit in alliance or other security relationships such as ANZUS into your framework?
Well, thanks so much to Tanaka Nobuo for the question. It's a great question because a lot of people might be thinking about, why not ANZUS and why not all these other groups I didn't include. Put simply, if New Zealand was still an ANZUS, it would be on my list. But it's a bilateral. It's an Australia-US security alliance. And the reason that AUKUS is on the list is because it includes more than two. So I didn't include, just bilateral agreements. Otherwise, you can imagine what the list would be like. Similarly, there are other groups, but they don't have a diplomacy or security aspect to them. So I also didn't include them. But the question also goes to, what about like you said, Gordon, the network of US alliances in the region, where does that fit in? I mean, my report talks about partly the reason for this explosion of groups is because the Indo-Pacific has no NATO. CETO is long gone. I had a look to make sure it wasn't, still alive somewhere. CETO is definitely dead. But basically, there's this proliferation because the strategic circumstances are getting worse. We don't have a NATO. And frankly, having a Trump president and the US kind of distracted and wars in Ukraine, we have every reason to want to create these new groupings. And I have also heard on the grapevine that there are two other groups in the pipeline, an Australia, South Korea, US trilat, and an Australia, Philippines, Malaysia trilat. Now, who knows if they'll ever eventuate, but you can see there's more coming. Like, how are we going to fit in all of these different groups? And I think, what we need to do is identify which ones we want to spend our time and energy in. And like Susan said, they need to be groups that don't always include the US, and we need to include Korea. I mean, if I'm getting rid of MICTA, where does Korea fit in? And I obviously have a very soft spot for South Korea. And in the paper, one of the things that I argue is for a new quad. We've already got Australia, India, Indonesia. Well, South Korea has, exceptionally good relationships with all three of those countries. And if we were to downgrade MICTA, I would love to see South Korea join Australia, India, Indonesia, Korea, so that we could have a different quad that wasn't attached to any of the negative baggage associated with the quad that we currently have, in partly reasons that South Korea and others don't want to get involved in the quad because, China's saying that it's an anti-China coalition. So, yeah, we need to think about incorporating other countries. We need to think about groups that don't involve the US. So that's why no ANZUS.
Well, we have to think about acronyms, because already I'm thinking Australia, India, Indonesia, Korea is either AHIC or Kia or something.
Yeah.
Just right.
Well, Kia is extra I, but it's a name that Koreans will know well.
We'll get sponsored by the company.
We had also Kono Taro talk about JAUKUS at our event earlier this week. So there's some awesome acronyms.
Some of those on the audience day before yesterday, we were fortunate to host the former foreign minister, defense minister, Kono Taro, and he did indeed propose Japan joining AUKUS, and so it became JAUKUS, which was a name into itself. Jeffrey Robertson did respond with, which I think is probably the name for the newest punk band in Australia, called Death by Digital. It works. It's a modern thing. Works out well. Let me bring Richard and Susan back into this conversation by reframing that point a little bit more broadly. When I transitioned to becoming an Aussie and moving to Perth some 8 years ago, I was struck by something I had not understood when looking at it from Washington, D.C. And that was, looking back for the last 30 years, I was hard-pressed to identify a single regional initiative where the United States was involved, in which Australia was not there first and actively lobbying the United States to be involved. And so whether it is APEC itself, or the East Asia Summit, or the ASEAN Regional Forum, or the Trans-Pacific Partnership, Australia, through its membership in regional fora, has played a really important role in kind of pulling the United States into this region and enticing into this region. So I kind of want to turn to the two of you to think about how important Australia's role is in securing the participation of countries who we presume will have a similar point of interest, perhaps more weight than Australia might be in this region. I'll start with you this time, Susan, then we'll go to Richard after that, if that's okay.
was really hoping you'd start with Richard because I think this is such a two-edged sword. You know, I think we have this dueling, desperate need to integrate, make America care about our region, which has been increasingly difficult for various reasons, and to really needed to properly pivot and to be more than a defence posture, much more of an actual, we care about the region, we're invested in the region. But at the same time, we're trying to, there are dangers in that, especially when, you're trying to navigate, geostrategic competition. So, from my view, having as nimble a position as possible is really important. And I think we struggle with that balance, but I would love to hear what Richard says.
Richard?
Yeah, it's a great question, Gordon. Look, I think a couple of quick points. One is the United States has its own interest in staying connected to the region, and sometimes they're very kind to us and, tell us that it's all about Australia's support and helping them get in there. But of course, they're very active and engaged in pursuing their own national interest. But your basic point is absolutely right. It's definitely in Australia's interest to keep America engaged in the region as much as we can, both in a security and in an economic sense. And I would argue it's actually more important than ever now. In fact, it's absolutely essential. We're currently running a strategy that's trying to create a balance of power in the Indo-Pacific that is favourable to us or favourable to freedom, to quote the current Prime Minister, and it would be very difficult to do without the strongest possible American engagement in the region. In my own view, that doesn't mean American primacy. We don't actually need that, I think, for this strategy to have a decent chance of success. So we do it. We're going to keep doing it. I'm less worried than Susan's about the downsides because, I think we have to do it now. We just have few choices at the moment. I think the challenges are so significant. And secondly, the alliance does occasionally cause us headaches in the region. It has done so in the past and probably will in the future. But I think it's possible to overstate those. I'm one of those who generally think that the alliance actually gives us greater weight in Asia. And then just a last quick one, which is a very obvious one, that the latest example of your point is, of course, the gentle nagging we make to America about a TPP or CPTPP as it is now. Now, that's a hopeless cause at the moment. The domestic politics in America just make it impossible, but it's something that we're all going to keep chipping away on and hope at some point for a break in the weather.
If I could just build on one thing that you just said, Richard, that kind of feeds back to an earlier concern that you expressed, Susan. As somebody who spent 30 plus years working on Korea, for the first 7 or 8 years in Australia, I kind of felt like I was banging my head against the wall, trying to get Koreans to pay attention to Australia and to get Australians to pay attention to Korea. Neither side really would prioritize the relationship with the other. And I ended up writing a chapter on it called Peers, Not Partners, right? We just didn't know quite how to deal with each other. But one of the things that's happened in the last several years is that with the Quad, with AUKUS in particular, Korea has just kind of woken up and said, wow, look at where Australia is doing. We need to have an Australia policy. So the relative priority of Korea, Australia to Korea has gone up. And at the same time, Australia, after 18 months now at the receiving end of economic coercion, is finally starting to get serious about economic diversification strategy. There isn't a viable economic diversification strategy that doesn't involve Korea. So finally, Australia realizes that Korea is an important partner. So I'm pretty optimistic that relationship, which has languished for so long, it will be accelerated. We're running out of time very quickly, but I wanted to take that last question and kind of flip it on its end, because we've already touched on this in several ways. As much as these regional forums might be important for bringing others in the region, they're also troubling for people maybe that we don't want, right? So I'll give, Richard made the comment that, MICTA was going fine, and I would agree with this until Erdogan essentially killed it, right? When Erdogan was, one of these countries was not like the other, it made it quite difficult. Today, we're grappling with the question of a G20 meeting in Indonesia, and whether or not Russia should be there or not, given the fact that Russia's actions over the last 3 months have kind of been a repudiation of everything either the G20 or the G7 or candidly the UN was established to kind of repudiate. And so I'm kind of curious if I might just, we're really short on time, just a quick start with you, Haley. Are there difficulties in these regional groupings and forums with people that we don't want to include, as opposed to those that we're trying to entice in?
Yes, it really does matter who's in the room. And I can understand why we would want to exclude countries like Russia, for example. It's a good diplomatic statement. But ultimately, it also relates to our decision not to expel the Russian ambassador from Australia, because as soon as you get rid of someone or you don't have them in the room, communication is not possible, or it's a one-sided communication. And I actually think about the six-party talks, which I didn't include the six-party talks. And for anyone who doesn't know what that is nuclear disarmament talks for North Korea. And I didn't include I didn't include that group because Australia is not a member, although I heard that Kevin Rudd was very keen for us to join the six-party talks. But the point I make is that people look at the six-party talks, they say it was a failure, they say North Korea continued to nuclearize. All of that is true. My point is that sometimes talking delays countries, and I would choose delay over not having them in the room. And sometimes delaying can be your answer. So I would caution against excluding countries. And I'm sure many diplomats agree, communication is the only way to resolve these problems.
Yeah. All right, quick response. Susan, any final response on that front before we wrap up?
I think the idea of Russia's attendance to the Asian summits is just so interesting because of the precedents it might set around China and Taiwan, for example. So, these summits have to be very careful about setting precedents about who is expelled for what reasons, on what terms. I think it will be, I don't think it's going to happen, but what I think will happen is that countries will boycott and not go. And I think that is quite devastating for Indonesia's, rightly, time to shine in a global governance setting, which has never had the opportunity before. So it's very upsetting for me.
Thank you. Richard, final thoughts.
Yeah, well, look, we're going to walk and chew gum on this one, Gordon. We will keep working in like-minded groups, but the more inclusive forums are also still important to us. And Russia's a bit sui generis here. I mean, it's as bad as China's behaviour is, it hasn't done a Russia. So I think the China test, we will want China in the room. The China test would come in a serious Taiwan contingency, for example. I agree with Susan. It's sad. It's sad that Indonesia's time in the sun on the G20 has been rocked by this. But it's a fair way to go to the summit yet. So let's not rule out something happening. And the Indonesians have been clever by inviting both. And I'd be surprised if Putin actually left Moscow at all.
Understood. Hey, we are running out of time. There are some wonderful other questions from those who are joining us in the panel. Bart, I think it's Bart Hogeveen actually asked me, was asking the question of whether or not we just might downgrade, the participation to the secretary, DepSec, or PermRed, or head of missions rather than head of leaders, which is interesting. And Michael Fay made a very important point about the kind of the track 2 levels that kind of spill on beyond just the official letters. And so any considerations you might have, on the official level will also have ramifications on the track 2 level. But great conversations. We can continue well. The work that we do at the center is really designed to kind of contribute to these types of discussions and insightful policy thinking. And so, Haley, once again, congratulations to you on your report. We wish you all the best as you head off to I guess with Susan as well, right? To Fulbright in Washington, D.C. Certainly a fascinating time to be there. And thank you to everybody for joining us for this conversation today. Richard and Susan, for your insights and being willing to contribute to the launch of this report. Thank you so much. We'll be in touch.